ways in which a community is not serving, is not doing well. The fact that we don't have sick leave in this community is a huge issue. The fact that we have underserved communities historically in our city that now has left them more susceptible to this virus, I hope is making ever more apparent the historic injustices that have existed in the city, and I hope that we exit this with greater resolve to fix these. I'm trying really hard to encourage the city with respect to the funding that it gets from the federal government to do two things. To focus on those populations that are not otherwise being served by the federal funding, so that we can use the money everywhere we can to help communities that would otherwise fall outside of the safety net. And then second, to take a look at all the things that we spend money on with an eye not only to dealing with the immediate emergency, but hoping to build capacity and infrastructure that can last us as we go forward. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here in this call. I was on a call not too dissimilar to this, I think, just a couple of days ago, and it was suggested that we try to get a different avenue for people to be able to cash their checks that they're getting from the federal government. And I think we may very well have HEB stepping forward to just cash checks so that people don't have to go to payday lenders. Not something I would have initiated absent having been on that phone call. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and to learn, and obviously to answer questions. There are two tools of this office that I have, and really it's the only real powers this office has. It's the ability to use a bully pulpit and the ability to convene people. And I want you and the community to think of those tools as tools that belong to you. And if there's a way for me to use those tools in a constructive, productive way, just point me and shoot. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so now we'll have Eric Tang give us some context and history on anti-Asian racism in the US.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank the organizers, Haley, Lucy, and my fellow panelists for doing this. And I'm just wishing all of the folks who are on this or joining us, about 150 participants I see, maybe more on Facebook, just hoping everyone's staying healthy, staying safe. So I'm going to begin by just talking about the current context, and wanted to address or begin with some comments about what people already may know, and that is that there's a rising tide of anti-Asian violence related to the current crisis. We have groups around the country who are tracking the rise of anti-Asian violence. One group in particular that got out in front of it kind of early is known as AAPI, Hate Reporting Project, I believe out of San Francisco State University. And within the first 2 weeks after launching in mid-March, they received more than 1,100 reports. That number has grown leaps and bounds since then. And of course, these are numbers that they're reporting when people are sheltering in. We can only imagine what it might look like when people are no longer sheltering in. And the federal government is projecting a steady increase in hate crimes against Asians, which should also come as no big surprise to many of us who've been paying attention to the news. And what I want to do today is two things. I want to talk about how what we're seeing is not just individual and anecdotal, but structural and historical, meaning that this is about something that's embedded within US history, cultures, and economies. And I want to bring that out a little bit today. And then maybe to prime the discussion that I think we're going to have towards the end of this session, and that is, what does an effective anti-racism look like? What should people actually effectively do? And also, what is an ineffective anti-racism in this context? And why don't we begin by just addressing the term that President Trump used recently to describe COVID-19. And he used the term Chinese virus. And many of you may know this, having paid attention to the news, that he actually took the speech that his speechwriters had given him, and he crossed out COVID or Corona and in place put in Chinese virus. So there was a deliberate move here that he was making. And I want to begin by suggesting that he was engaging in this term, in this idea of a Chinese virus, as what we call a racial project. He was intending to have a particular kind of racial effect. And it's one that is deeply embedded in US history and culture. A lot of my students, I teach the Intro to Asian American Studies course. A lot of my students in recent weeks have been asked why they find this so offensive. What exactly is it about Chinese virus that you find to be so racist? After all, didn't it originate in China? And so they're put on the defensive. They're put in the position of having to explain why they feel the way they do. And I think that's really interesting, because very often what happens is the people who feel racism are put in the position to explain their feelings, but we don't really ask the people who are being racist why exactly they're so invested in terms like the Chinese virus. What is it about this particular term that caused the President of the United States to take a Sharpie, cross out coronavirus, and enter Chinese virus? And so what I want to begin with today is maybe a discussion about what is behind that. What are the intentions behind using the term? And when you ask people, well, why do you insist on using it? They say, well, I'm not racist. I just feel like using it. It's my First Amendment right to free speech. Didn't it emerge there? So you get all these banal, blithe remarks, right? When it comes to explaining your racism, and the onus of having to explain why you feel racially attacked or offended falls on the people who feel that way. And what I want to do today is at least, begin to flip the script on that just a bit. Okay, so what is a racial project? A racial project is a term that refers to how certain ideas about what is American, what is culturally appropriate, what is dominant, are embedded in our culture. So for instance, there's a racial project that equates citizenship and Americanness with whiteness, and this is historical. We saw it in the naturalization laws of 1790, which essentially said that only those who are free white people who have been in the United States for 2 years can become naturalized as citizens. And so there was always a way in which Americanness and whiteness were coupled. And then we saw it again in 1882 with our first laws, which actually excluded a racial and ethnic group. And that was the Chinese exclusion laws of 1882. So essentially what these two laws said was that Asians can never become white, and therefore their citizenship or their Americanness is impossible, right? This was the racial project which equated citizenship and Americanness with whiteness. And it's structural, it's embedded in our culture. And what President Trump is doing by calling it the Chinese virus is he's reinvoking this history, which casts Asians, in particular Chinese, as impossible citizens, or people for whom citizenship is impossible because their whiteness is impossible. And so he's bringing that back because it works, it's effective for certain political ends, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that's really the historical context behind what he's doing by crossing out coronavirus and entering Chinese virus. So what are some other examples of racial projects in the US, right? We see this with respect to Chinese and Asian Americans now, but in the US we have other examples, such as the way in which poverty and crime have been historically racialized as distinctly Black social problems. The racialized and gendered terms that are meant to humiliate and cast blame, such as welfare queen, the underclass, thug. These are all examples of racial projects. In other words, this is a way, or these are ways in which to carry out anti-Black racism in policies and in economies in implicit ways. This is what we mean when we say that racism is structurally embedded, right? Through the use of these terms that code poverty and crime as distinctly Black. But moving back to the effects that these racial projects have on US history and culture, again, one of the major effects that it had, structural effects that it had, was it led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first immigration law in the United States, which outlawed a particular group from coming to the US, right? So these notions that Asians could never assimilate, that there would always be foreign, that there was no way that they could ever really be citizens because they could never be white, led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, our first gatekeeping immigration policy in the history of the United States. And what drove that policy to become law was a campaign that looked at how Chinese were, again, unassimilable, how they were impossible in terms of being able to become part of America and become white. And the language of virulence and contagion was used in order to carry out that notion, in order to carry out that effect. And if you look a little carefully at the flyer that is circa the late 1800s, it says here that you shouldn't buy from Chinese bakeries because if you do, you will be infected by disease, right? And there's a picture of how a morgue is located right next to the Chinese bakery, right? And so this notion of Chinese contagion, virulence, and infection has long been part of US history and was very much the discourse leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But again, this wasn't just discursive. This wasn't just people representing racist depictions of Chinese Americans. It was also violent. It was attended to by violence against Asians in the public sphere. And you had, for instance, the Chinese Massacre of Los Angeles in 1871, where in the lead up to the Chinese exclusion laws, at least 20 Chinese Americans were killed in mob attacks. And then finally, of course, the Exclusion Act is passed. Here is a political cartoon from that period, right? And Chinese Americans are now cast as those who are trying to get into the country illegally, right? Now that we've barred them, they're still trying to find any nook and cranny to become, migrants to cross the border illegally. In many ways, one might argue that they are the first so-called illegal immigrants to the United States. And as a result, we build our first detention centers to house Chinese Americans. Here is a detention center on Angel Island in California, off the San Francisco Bay. Okay, so fast forwarding to the present period, or at least the mid 20th century, American liberalism says that you can no longer uphold statutory racism, right? And so laws like the Chinese Exclusion Law are dismantled. You have the Civil Rights Act of the mid 1960s, which says you can't, by law, be racist. You can't discriminate against any racial or ethnic group. However, political forces or movements still find political value in racial projects that render Asians and Asian Americans perpetually foreign, right? Or as categorically un-American. And so we see this in the current administration, where even though you can't uphold laws which discriminate against race or ethnic groups, there's still a lot of political currency in racial projects that render Asians and Asian Americans perpetually foreign, or Latinx people as perpetually foreign and illegal. We see the political impact and effect that it can have. The question remains, how do you mount a political challenge to these reactionary movements, right? Now that you can no longer be in a statutory way racist, how do you still maintain an anti-racism against these reactionary movements? Well, I'm gonna begin by answering that question in a way that talks about what you shouldn't do, like, what are things that are faulty strategies for anti-racism? And I'm going to begin by pointing out or highlighting an op-ed written by Andrew Yang, who, as you know, ran for the Democratic nomination, ran as a Democratic presidential candidate. Andrew Yang, in a recent op-ed in the Washington Post, wrote, "Now many in the Asian American community are stepping up, trying to demonstrate that we can be part of the solution. Some 17% of US doctors are Asians and rushing to the front lines. We Asian Americans need to embrace and show our Americanness in ways we never have before." So his strategy for anti-racism is to prove your Americanness. So this is Andrew Yang. And he goes on, he says, "We need to step up, help our neighbors, donate gear, vote, wear red, white, and blue, volunteer, fund aid organizations, and do everything in our power to accelerate the end of this crisis. We should show without a shadow of a doubt that we are Americans who will do our part for our country in this time of need. We need to demonstrate that we can be part of the solution. We are not the virus, but we can be part of the cure." And what I want to argue is that this is a flawed anti-racist strategy. It's a flawed anti-racist strategy because it doesn't discuss the structural racism that historically has undergirded anti-Asian violence in the US. But I would also say that in many ways, frontline workers would be offended by what Andrew Yang is saying. And on a personal note, I'll say that I have 3 family members in New York who are frontline workers, one of whom, my brother, who was recently infected and is very sick right now. He's worked 12 hours in an ER in Queens. How else could he not have been infected? And I will tell you that there's no part of him that feels he needs to demonstrate his Americanness. This is not about proving anything to the racists. This is not about positive images of Asian Americans. And this might sound self-serving, but I think Andrew Yang would have benefited from an ethnic studies course at the college level, because he would have learned that every attempt that Asian Americans made throughout history to prove their Americanness in the face of racism backfired, because it ultimately did what? It ultimately conceded to or affirmed the racism in the first instance, right? And so anti-racism is not about proving your Americanness, it's about doing what? It's about engaging in actual anti-racism, all right? So don't prove your Americanness, challenge the racist and structural racism instead. And what this means, and I think people are going to build on this later in the presentation, is building solidarity with other groups of color by joining efforts that address, 1, the racial disparities in infection and mortality rates among African Americans. I should say African Americans, not American Americans. That's something that Mayor Adler just mentioned. The disparate impact of the economic fallout on Black and brown communities. I think that the movement against anti-Asian racism would be most effective if it mobilized in this context. And by way of closing, I want to draw inspiration from Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist, as we know, our most famous abolitionist, an African-American freedom activist, who during the era of Chinese exclusion took a firm stance against the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, writing that "the great right I assert for the Chinese and Japanese and for all other varieties of men equally with yourselves, now and forever. I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity. And when there is a supposed conflict between human and national rights, it is safe to go the side of humanity." And so what Douglass is saying, I think what he's forecasting, is that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., that you can't possibly call for anti-racism in one community without seeing how the racism in another community stages your racial oppression. And so with Douglass's words in mind, I'd like to move to the conversation about how we can begin looking at racial solidarity as the foundation of our anti-racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So now we are going to do a poll of the audience. So we would like to know what is your race? So we have multiple choice. We weren't allowed to do multiple boxes, so I understand. I'm half Latina, so sorry about that. Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Sorry about that. Multi-race. Oh, Rocio said that it actually does allow you to check more than one box. Okay, so here are the results. We have 3% American Indian or Alaska Native, 56% Asian, 10% Black or African American, 18% Latinx, Latino, or Hispanic, 1% Middle Eastern or North African, and 20% white. Okay. So now we're going to move on to Ayshea.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you, Haley, Achi, and the Equity Office for their support and organization of such an important conversation. My name is Ayshea Khan. I'm the Asian American Community Archivist at the Austin History Center. The Austin History Center is the historic division of the Austin Public Library and the official archive for the city of Austin. And as an Asian American community archivist, I work with longtime Asian community members and organizations to collect, preserve, and provide access to local histories so that generations to come can understand that Asians have always had a place in shaping what our city is today. And I do have a presentation. So thank you, Eric, for providing such a great context to begin and open our conversation. My goal is to provide some local connections to some of these broader historical movements and acts of anti-Asian racism we are witnessing now. It's important to recognize that Austin also has a history rooted in anti-Asian racism, while also serving as a site for Asian American organizing, solidarity, and community care. So if we look back as far as the late 1800s, we can begin to see traces of racial fear towards the Asian community in Austin. Shortly after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Knights of Labor, one of the first organized unions in Texas, issued a boycott to all citizens of Austin, urging them to withdraw their patronage from all city in the city, very similar to the flyer that Eric shared just a few moments ago. During this time in Austin, Chinese were living throughout the city. They ran laundromats, groceries, and other small service-oriented businesses. And there was a fear that these establishments would take away opportunities from low-income white workers in Austin. In this 1885 article from the Daily Statesman, the union argues that the Mongolian can never assimilate with the Caucasian race, that they are nomads ready at any moment to fold their tents and steal away to the Orient. Acts like this planted the seeds for modern stigmas that Asian Americans encounter every day, that no matter how hard we work or how long we live here, Asians will always be viewed as a perpetual foreigner by systems in the United States. A community story from this same time period is that of Joe Singh, a Chinese laborer who came to Austin in the late 1800s, and he later married Frances Moreno, a Mexican-American resident of Austin and cook for future state governor Ma Ferguson. The two opened Hong Lee Laundry on Congress Avenue and had 3 children together. But because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Joe Singh was ineligible for American citizenship, because national laws decreed that US women who married non-citizens were no longer American. Frances was also forced to forfeit her own citizenship. The 1920s were also a period of rising anti-Japanese sentiment in Austin. In 1921, there was an anti-Japanese conference held in the Driscoll Hotel to, quote, combat the colonization by Japanese in Texas. Legislators from across the state aimed to draft policies that would prohibit Japanese from buying land. And in 1937, a similar bill was targeted not just towards Japanese, but Chinese and South Asians as well, the only people at the time who were ineligible to become citizens. However, this bill didn't actually get passed due to a group of Chinese community members who gathered in the Texas Senate to protest the bill. And this is an early example of Asian activism that challenges the common stereotype that Asians are always passive bystanders in acts of racism. When talking about legacies of racialized oppression in Austin, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the 1928 City Plan of Austin, which forced African-American communities once located throughout the city to move east of East Avenue, now I-35, through the relocation of city services to a designated Negro district. While Austin's Black population was the only community targeted in this plan, by 1934, we can see that the majority of Black and Latinx communities were located in East Austin. There's no mention of Chinese or Asian communities at this time in city policy, most likely because they were not considered American citizens. Yet many lived and operated small businesses in East Austin. So for example, Joe Singh and Francis Moreno lived in East Austin as well. The 1928 plan not only enabled segregation and white supremacy to thrive in Austin, but it set the stage for long-term housing and health inequities for Black and Brown folks. While East Austin became home to thriving Black and Brown community gatherings, education, and community and cultural arts, the city of Austin deemed it a hazardous, undesirable area where high industry and pollution have had long-lasting health impacts that continue to be seen today. And when we look at the current Austin neighborhoods that are at a much higher risk for COVID-19 severity, we can't help to see an all too familiar pattern in our city. I bring up this story because as Asians facing oppression due to COVID-19, it's important to understand how other forms of systemic racism are affecting other communities of color here in Austin so that we can better understand and demonstrate solidarity for those communities. If we jump forward towards during World War II, this kind of anti-Asian racism is only increasing. Longtime prominent Chinese community member Mitchell Wong, who's the young boy you see in the photograph on the right, recalls going to his East Austin school having to wear a sign saying, "I am Chinese," to avoid any suspicion from his teachers or peers. This account highlights the fact that despite the diversity of our Asian American communities, the state and system often only see a single Asian race. And Texas was home to 5 detention centers during World War II, one of which was Crystal City, not far from San Antonio. And California's Osamu Taniguchi was incarcerated with his family there. And he later settled in the Valley after their family's release. Osamu is known in Austin as the man who built the Japanese gardens at Zilker Botanical Gardens, which he completed for free as a gift for peace in the city. And today, a coalition of Japanese Americans formerly incarcerated at Crystal City are currently organizing to protest the current mass detentions of migrant families in Texas. Since 1965, we have seen many new waves of diverse Asian American communities enter Austin. And the attacks on September 11th shook the entire Austin community, but also made South Asians, Muslims, and Arabs the new target for anti-Asian racism and Islamophobia. Saheli, the South Asian organization that evolved into Asian Family Support Services of Austin, not only provided culturally specific resources for families facing violence, but provided active support for South Asian community during the post 9/11 period, while also fighting anti-war, LGBTQ, and pro-immigration movements. And there have been other remarkable moments of Asian American activism and solidarity. Examples include the movement in the 1990s for the creation of the Center of Asian Americans at UT, Asian American Studies at UT, which was an intersectional student-led initiative organized by the Asian American Relations Group in partner with the Anti-Racist Organizing Committee. Community organizer Amy Wong Mock and the Network for Asian American Organizations were some of the first to organize for political representation, as well as for physical community spaces, such as the Asian American Cultural Center and the Asian American Resource Center. As the Asian population becomes the fastest growing in Austin, we are beginning to see so many more platforms for APA organizing and storytelling. But as we mobilize to stand up against the inequities of our communities of color are fighting against today, I believe it's always important to remember these historical foundations and what our elders have laid for us. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share a few stories. This certainly is not a complete picture of a long and complicated history. And there are many Asian communities in Austin that are facing anti-Asian racism that I did not have a chance to mention today. But if you have a story that you would like to share with me, a historical archive that you'd like to share, please feel free to contact me. My information's on this slide, and I think we're going to share the slides out afterwards. So thank you again for all of your time, and I look forward to hearing what the rest of the panels have to share today.
Thank you, Ayshea, for that. So now we're going to be moving on to our second section, which is on where we'll have the opportunity to share some of our experiences. Before we start, I'd like to launch this poll. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low and 5 being high, how much fear and anxiety do you feel about COVID-19 motivated racism? So here are the results. We have 7% said low, 13% said rated at a 2, 33% rated at a 3, 29% at 4, and 19% at high, 5. So today, to start off sharing some of our experiences, is we're going to have Akeela Kongdara.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this town hall. My name is Somprathana Akeela Kongdara. I am a second-generation Lao American student majoring in political communications at UT Austin. I am currently serving as the research director for the Burnt Rice Bunch, which is a Pan-Asian youth advocacy group working to break the model minority myth that has been put upon us. During this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been an increased amount of anti-Asian racism. We have been accustomed to blaming others for the inconveniences that this pandemic has created. However, we shouldn't resort to racism and xenophobia. Since the beginning of the virus, media has played a major role in our fears and anxieties as a society. Media has shaped this so-called enemy of a virus through the Asian community. At first, I thought the virus and the anti-Asian racism would blow over. Most of the racism and harassment was on social media, and for people my age, memes and TikToks are a form of coping and expression. So if you don't see something you like, you're able to just keep scrolling and block someone if you have that issue. Now, it wasn't until mid-February that I realized the extent of the virus and its effects. I realized the rhetoric surrounding COVID-19 was similar to the rhetoric used during the Chinese exclusion era. I started feeling sick at the thought of the virus and the idea that over 100 years after the exclusion era, we are having the same conversation resurface. Going on to March, social distancing practices began, and I began hearing stories of Asian Americans being scared of going to grocery stores or going to work, basically doing basic necessities of life. And tensions continue to rise, and I became increasingly anxious with the ifs. If I would become a victim of the virus, and not through contracting the virus, but through the sociocultural influences of the virus. If someone I love would become a victim, and if this would ever end. Then on March 15th, I switched into survival mode. On March 15th, an Asian American family of 3 got stabbed at a Sam's Club in Midland, Texas. 2 of the family members were young children. If in Midland, Texas, not too far from Austin, a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old can get stabbed at a Sam's Club on a Sunday afternoon, how do I know I'm not the next victim? That following week, President Donald Trump used Chinese virus to describe the novel coronavirus. I was in Austin deciding if I was going to return home to my family in Amarillo, Texas. The presidential address added to my anxiety, and I feared my drive home. However, if I stayed in Austin, I would have been alone during this situation. I decided to return home, and the entire 9-hour drive, I was scared to stop at a gas station or use the restroom, because what if I was the next target? What if someone would inflict their anger on me? For the first time, I was more scared of being an Asian American than being a young woman driving across the state of Texas. Earlier this month, a sacred statue at a Lao Buddhist temple was vandalized. The Lao community was speechless. With the Laotian New Year's approaching, it was a reminder that we are not wanted here in the United States. We are potential targets of this hate, and this attack on my community opened my eyes to the evils of this world. If someone could attack a religious, a place of, holy, I guess the fact let me regather my thoughts. If someone could inflict their anger on a place of religious worship, then how do we know we are protected in this situation? A little over a week ago, my brother and I ran to a grocery store to get buns for our burgers. My dad was grilling. As we were walking down the bread aisle, a woman whispered to her son, "Don't get too close." The woman and her son duo looked at us in disgust, as if we were something, we had taken something from them, as if we were monsters. I was born in the United States. I've lived here my whole entire life, and heck, I don't even have a passport to leave this country. And despite all this, I suddenly became a foreigner to this country I call home. Although I haven't been physically attacked, this added salt to my open wound, asking the questions of what if again, if this would happen again, if this would happen to someone I love and I'm not around. Taking my experience, it is important to understand that words can be just as harmful as actions, and that words can also turn into actions. With this time of social distancing, we aren't on campus to see how students are affected by the anti-Asian rhetoric. However, our campus has gone virtual in the sense of Zoom lectures, but also all our time we spend is spent on social media. We are constantly being pumped with information and content related to this time. It is time we take action against the anti-Asian rhetoric that is being used. We need to open the discussion and educate people on corrective histories, calling for solidarity between people, between all people of all identities, because resilience comes in numbers. Thank you.
Akeela, thank you so much for sharing that. So our next panelist is going to be Amy Wong Mok. There you go.
Hello. Yeah, I am muted. So can you hear me? Yeah. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. So I'm just so sorry to hear what had happened to my previous panelists. Well, recently I have heard this saying among ourselves that we are more afraid of the people than the virus. And I think it is a very sad statement that many of the Asian Chinese families are afraid to go to the grocery store. They are ordering and pick up because they are so afraid that they will be attacked. You know, I have reported what I have heard, stories about family with children getting attacked, seniors getting attacked, young women getting attacked in broad daylight in downtown. And so I am just so thankful the leadership in our city have passed this resolution. You know, it is a public action to condemn this violence in our community. But in order for us to really feel comfortable to talk about our stories, we need to have the environment that is nurturing for these stories to be heard. So I think it is up to the people who have the power. I mean, I truly believe there are more good people in our community than those races. So I think we need to challenge the good people to stand by the victim whenever they see violence against them, around them, to provide a safe environment for them to feel comfortable again. Because, you know, if you were being victimized and nobody around you say anything, what does that mean? That means it's acceptable. So that means it's emboldened, you know, by their silence, they embolden those bad behaviors. So I remember, you know, over 10 years ago, when the UT10, you know, the students get arrested at UT when they were trying to set up the Center for Asian American Study, and they were arrested. They were called by the, you know, VP at that time, and they were arrested. And I had this conversation with Ronnie Earl at that time, you know, our district attorney. And I said, well, we are trying to encourage our citizens, you know, the Asian Americans, you know, to come forward to exercise their civil rights, but then they get arrested because they are having different treatments. So I'm glad the conversation that I have Ronnie, you know, have some positive outcome. So I think structurally, I think we need to provide an environment that really encourages stories being told. I am going to challenge the good people who are not Asian Americans, that who are willing to really step in and say, hey, you know, if you are afraid, you know, to challenge the races, at least stand by the victim and say that, are you okay? This is not Austin. So can you just imagine in Sam's Club parking lot, 10 people go to the victim and isolate the racist. So I think the racist will have a second thought about repeating his racist act. So I'm going to challenge good people in our community to stand by the victim, to provide us with a safe environment, you know, so that we can just enjoy whatever, you know, we can enjoy. I mean, not being able to go grocery shopping and have to really order, taking order, you know, online. I think that in itself is limiting our civil rights, don't you think? So, I mean, if the mayor, you ask us, you know, about what you can do. So I'm going to, I think it needs to be some public action to say that good people need to step up. I'm invited to speak at 2 companies about this environment, this climate. And I told them, I'm not just talking to the Asian American employees in your company. I want to speak to your entire company. People who are not Asian Americans, they are the one who need to step up, you know, and anti-racism, racism, because they are with their folks who were conducting these bad behaviors, and they have to confront them, and you know, and then we will feel more comfortable, you know, to come forward and tell our stories. Until more good people are willing to create that environment for us, it is hard for us to really come forward without jeopardizing ourselves. So I think for a betterment of our community, we need to have more good people to come forward.
Thank you so much, Amy. Next, we have Loon. She's the Burmese Community Health Navigator with the Austin Asian Community Health Initiative.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Loon, and I work for Austin Asian Community Health Initiative as Burmese Community Health Navigator. It is my privilege to speak on behalf of Burmese people to share our story and experience with all of you. Before COVID-19, we already have our daily life problems. For example, in public benefits, when we would like to apply for SNAP, Medicaid, or other services, there's no translated application available for us. Parents, they can't talk to the school teachers directly because of communication barrier. Even at the hospital or clinic, there's no patient intake form that are available for us in our language. So when we visit to the doctor office, we need someone to go with us and help out the paperwork for us. Now we have COVID-19. We are in need of financial assistance. There's no articles or instruction in our language that we can read and apply for unemployment benefits, stimulus check, rent, and utility assistance. At the same time, we have seen videos of Asian people got attacked over coronavirus in all over the world. No one intervened to help us. When I see those videos, it really breaks my heart. There's one Burmese. We don't deserve to treat in this way. So there's one Burmese man who got attacked so badly by a group of people over coronavirus, and he was hospitalized. Another case of a Burmese father and son got attacked with a knife at Costco in Midland, Texas. There's no guarantee for us. Same thing could not happen in Austin, Texas. This could happen to us at any time. A friend of mine shared with me her experience that kids were playing at the playground of her apartment complex. When she was passing by, she heard someone said, "Chinese are sick." It is from one of the kids who were playing at the playground. This is so sad to know that even the kids have negative views of Asian people. I also experienced that someone intentionally hit our trash bin with their car at night. I feel unsafe, helpless, ignorant, and abandoned. I woke up in the middle of the night due to anxiety and panic attack. This is not fair for us to get treated in this way just because we look like Chinese or we are Asian. We pay the tax to the government like everyone does. We follow, obey, and the law of this country. There's no guarantee letter provided by China for us saying, if you look like Chinese or if you are Asian, you will not get sick from the virus. We can get sick and we can die from the coronavirus too. We are afraid to die from coronavirus. So stop assuming that all Asian people have the virus automatically. Stop looking at us as like we are the virus carrier. Blaming us, yelling at us in public, accusing us that we are the cause of the virus, attacking us will not make the virus go away. Instead of against each other, attacking, killing each other, please pray for each other, support spiritually or emotionally. I hope we see more good, kinded heart, who has good, kinded heart, big heart, who are willing to support our community in Austin, Texas. Thank you, everyone, and thank you all the people who attend this and participants to support us. Thank you.
Loon, thank you so much for sharing your story. So next on our list, we have Darlene Lanham.
Hi, hi everybody. I'm Darlene. I lead Asian Family Support Services of Austin. I work alongside 20 very fierce women who are taking on the impact of individual and structural and systemic oppression and gender-based violence every day. It is my great honor to be a part of their team. I did just say, Akeela and Loon, thank you so much for sharing the personal impact. I know it's difficult in a forum like this, and I'm going to borrow a page from National Coalition Building Institute and just make a commitment to remember your story and to remember your words and to stand up in the face of and interrupt these kinds of oppressive actions, and to recognize how the climate of fear is being shaped and weighing down on every single one of us. And I would just ask the folks on chat and Facebook Live to really commit to remembering your story and remembering you and standing up and interrupting oppression. I wrote an op-ed that was published in the Austin Chronicle that sort of captures the client experience I'm about to share, which is that Asian and immigrant survivors of violence in Austin, Texas, Travis County, USA, right now are facing a triple threat of trauma and heightened danger under pandemic conditions. You know, the people who we serve were in crisis before the pandemic. And today, there's the layer of concern around their own personal health risk. There is the same economic distress and fallout, lost wages, lack of childcare, canceled school, cannot go to work, work is going out of business, those direct lost wages that everyone else is facing. And then now the racial blame. I have permission to share that actually one of my colleagues who is joining us as a leader in advancing women forward and reclaiming voices after violence, she herself experienced mistreatment and anti-Asian racism while at a Target. Somebody had refused to stand in line behind her and use the same checkout space. Luckily, she was in there was a bystander nearby who sort of called it out and noticed it, but it didn't change the impact on her. I'm just going to share a story of a client, two clients actually, and ask you to sort of like identify the structural racism that's going on. We have a client right now who is, she's pregnant. She's early in her pregnancy, first trimester. She's new to the US. She does not speak English. She uses one of our local federally qualified health centers, one of our community clinics for her health needs. She needs to see a doctor for prenatal care. Under the pandemic, a lot of healthcare is going telemed. That's great. So she's trying to get a telemedicine appointment. And she's been leaving messages to the clinic in her home language. And then when they respond back, they're responding back to her in English. And so they're playing phone tag, she in her home language, and it's coming back to her. 3 rounds back and forth over a period of too many days. And she hasn't yet been able to see a doctor by telemedicine. We have another client from South Asia who is stepping away from the most severe forms of physical abuse that we have seen in our agency. She actually has the virus. She has 2 small children, both under 4 years. One is an infant. right now, she's taking care of the children alone. She's just recently left her abuser. She does not have health insurance. The waiting period for the medical access program, is being approved. It's sitting on a desk somewhere. The child care, the free child care program that her children normally go to is closed, but they're all sick now. She works for a big box retail store, but they're not approving her paid sick leave. Her abuser is offering to help her, but she's got a protective order. And if she accepts his help with the children, she'll lose that protective order. And so these are the kinds of situations that we are really confronting on a daily basis. How do we help these very intense, very complex systems? Sort of how do we clear the path so that real people can get real support? And I want to say, in terms of solidarity and stepping up, the recent resolution that the city of Austin passed with the RISE Act funding is a huge relief. It's a huge step in the right direction. I mean, releasing cash or near cash transfers to people who are not qualified for the federal relief. It makes me so proud to live in a city like Austin, Texas. I think it's revolutionary. And I'm going to boldly say it's not enough. I mean, we are so grateful that the money will be coming soon, but we also have so many more actions to do and voices to raise up. I also want to just notice too, that when things like this happen, it's important for us to check in. I mean, even with our own communities, I think we have colorism. I think just like, poor confused candidate Andrew Yang, like reaching for that model minority and trying to prove his Americanness and his, his modelness. I mean, I think resisting that, like we don't have to be doctors to have value. We don't have to approximate the height of capitalism to have worth and to stand up and say that is our worth. I think that we in our own communities can challenge the colorism that exists. We can reach to our Black, African-American, African heritage sisters and brothers, and our Latinx sisters and brothers, and gender non-conforming siblings to interlock together and work together to push against the structures that are oppressing us all. So I'll just stop. I think I've maybe exceeded my time and say thank you.
Thank you so much, Darlene. So now we would like to open it up for the audience to participate. So there's a couple of ways. You can definitely, write in the comment box if you'd like to share. But right now we'd like for the AAPI folks in the audience to, if you'd like to share any experiences or feelings that you've had around COVID-19 and racism. So.
Hello. Hello.
Hi,
Anybody? Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My name is Harry Nguyen. Hi, Amy. My name is Harry Nguyen, and for the last 3 years, I'm helping the Vietnamese Senior Association in Austin, and let me talk a little bit about the Vietnamese Senior Association. We have about 80 members, and 60% of them over 70 years old. And for the last 2 years, we have the Meals on Wheel delivery food for us. And we're very happy about that. And we have the the fire department inspection for our building every year. We meet the code of the city. And suddenly last March, Meals on Wheels said that our building is not qualified, and they cut the meals on the 27th, March 27. First, we see a lot of topic and funding for the senior, American senior, or the minority senior to have food delivery and transportation and everything. We try to contact the city of Austin for all the help, but most of them, actually all of them, just say, sorry, we don't have any fund for you. And the only thing we have is Meals on Wheels delivered to our center every day. And last March, that means when the COVID-19 picked up, and then they cut the delivery on March 27. And worse than that, even on the 15th of March, they already cut the meals. When I asked them why, they said, well, you don't have it. And when I asked the reason, they just said, well, the building is not meet the code. And before that, actually, we have like several vandalism. We have the flag, Vietnamese flag and American flag hanging in front of our building. And the 3 times they come over and tear up the flag, American flag and the Vietnamese flag. We reported to the police, but it seemed that they just acknowledged it and then nothing happened. They don't even come down to see what happened. I think that it's hard to say that the racist or something about discrimination. They just blame that your building is not meet the spec. We rent a building 30 years, and every year we have the fire department come down to inspect it. So what they said is kind of like really vain. It's not valid. So I don't know if mayor or any people with power can step in and intervene with us or not. I think that partially because of the COVID-19 and partially because of we are Asian. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry, for sharing.
If Harry would reach out to my office and ask to speak with Leslie or with Janine, we'll take a look at why code enforcement has raised this issue now. Thank you, Harry.
Thanks, Mayor.
So do we have anyone else who would like to speak? If so, just press the raise hand button. If not, that's totally fine. Looks like we have someone who raised their hand. It's Schiller Lau.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I just put a note. I think there's some cases in the United States that are against the Asians and they're to be punished or even deal with by law. But we need to be careful that majority of the community is not always hostile to Asians. Maybe they're not. They probably keep themselves like a silent, But we need to be careful that don't take a whole community as enemies. I think there are very friendly communities that I know when I walk around in the stores, they are all friendly people. Maybe there are some cases, but we need to be careful that we don't generalize that and blow out of the proportion. That's my suggestion.
You know, Schiller, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially when we want to preserve the mental health of Asian Americans in general. But I also think the question that really sits with me during this period is how quickly things turned against Asian Americans. I mean, these numbers are rather startling when you look at the reporting. And by the way, these are underreported. Most of it's underreporting, and we're dealing with shelter in place and social distancing. Imagine what this might look like if we were not living under these conditions. And so while I think, you know, I hear you, and I hear you about not unnecessarily burdening ourselves with the kind of, I don't know what the word is, the kind of intensity that comes with feeling that everywhere you turn, there's somebody who is out to get you. This is a rather startling set of numbers that we're seeing during a period when people are not even socially interacting. And I think if we don't provide people with the tools they need to anticipate this, then we are doing them a disservice. And I'm also reminded too of the fact that there are people who, as one of our panelists mentioned, who are not in a position to advocate for themselves, who don't speak English, who are lower income, who don't really have a history in the United States where this is contextualized. Dealing with the class issues, the structural issues on top of this racism, I mean, that's what I'm really concerned about at this point. And it's not so much an indictment of American racism that I'm impressed with right now or interested in with right now. I'm more interested in how do we really anticipate what might come for a lot of communities, especially those who are unheard.
I also feel like it's, yes, we don't want to be paranoid or feed fear, but we have to recognize that it's real and it's happening. And I think it is up to, in a situation like this, it is up to those who are not being targeted to reach out to those who are. I mean, that's the and I don't want to like jump ahead. I know we're going to get into building solidarity, but it is not up to the targeted group to calm themselves. I mean, we're doing what we can, trying to sort of notice the beauty around us, notice what is right and real. But it also, I think that we also owe it to the larger community to stand up and say, this is actually really happening. This is not surreal. This is real. And then it's, and then to ask for our partners in the dominant culture or in the untargeted groups to do the reaching out to us.
Yeah, I think also that you look at the panelists, the people speaking up right now, you can see the majority of the attendees are women, and only like Mayor Adler, Eric, and myself, a man, and also another speaker. And I can see that from gender standpoint, it seems that the male is not so concerned about that. They think they are more able to protect themselves, but females is a little different. And I think we need to be sensitive to that because women has been very, very sensitive about this, keep their families safe, keep themselves safe. And man is more thinking, oh, I can protect myself, but that's not always true.
Schiller, I appreciate you sharing your experience. We do have an attendee who's raised their hand, so
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Cindy Sue will be joining us in just a second.
Hi. Well, Alt. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Hi. I guess, how can I start here? Living in Austin, I guess we don't realize that we have it pretty good around here. I grew up in Houston, and my brother and I were the only Asian kids or Chinese kids in our elementary school back in the 60s, so I'm really old. I was very upset to hear about the Meals on Wheels canceling the senior meals at the Vietnamese Center or housing project. I believe we need to have more of these stories so that we realize we're not in an isolated bubble, because I think in Austin, we tend to think that, oh, everybody's kind of cool. And then you see things like the rally that happened on the Capitol yesterday with the InfoWars people. But it would be nice that we have a forum or some way to know what else is going on in our community so we can stand up together to say, hey, that's not cool. And, you know, I work at the Austin Chronicle. I will definitely let people know that this happened, but people should let everybody know. It should not just be limited to a forum like this. And thank you guys for doing it. I have a friend that works at the Houston Community College, and I should have alerted her earlier, but there's a lot of people all over Texas that should know that people are together and we should be fighting it together rather than in separate isolated communities. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Cindy, for sharing. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it looks like our time is up for this section. So we're going to go ahead and start the next section on building solidarity. We're going to start it with a poll. So in the third poll, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low and 5 being high, how strong are Asian Americans in solidarity with other people of color? Okay, so here are our results. We have 20% who rated at 1, 31% rated 2, 32% rated at 3, 12% rated at 4, and 4% rate say that there's high solidarity with other people of color. So to start us off, we have Carmen.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I want to echo all of the thank yous to the organizers of this event and for inviting me both to participate and just give a few words briefly. And I also just want to thank all of you who are in some way or another on the front lines or the intermediaries supporting people who are on the front lines, especially the community health navigators and Loon and others. I want to thank you for your bravery, not just in sharing so deeply how this is impacting you and impacting community, but also just for the work that you're doing every day to support people. So I'm Carmen Yanes Pulido. I'm a community organizer in town, and I serve as executive director for Go Austin, Vamos Austin. And we are a coalition organizing for health equity in Austin's Eastern Crescent, specifically in Dove Springs and South Austin, and more recently in North Austin in the Renberg area and St. John's neighborhoods, where we definitely work with Asian American residents and community members all over, but particularly in North Austin, where the communities are so diverse, as many of you know. And so because we are a multiracial organization, but very Latino heavy, very Chicana heavy. And for that reason, we really rely on our multiracial networks all over in order to effectively be aware and understand how these issues are all affecting our different communities. So I was asked to speak a little bit about solidarity and what that looks like, and I'll be very brief. But I wanted to just start by saying, I think whenever we're talking about racial equity, racial justice, and solidarity, it's incredibly important to have a historical analysis and a people's history informing what we're doing. And so I so appreciate that this event began with that historical analysis, especially the local context, because I've been just privileged every time I get to hear another piece of Austin's history as it relates to Asian Americans, and also just the connections between Asian Americans and other communities of color, including the Mexican American and Latino community. I remember being blown away when I first went to the Asian American Cultural Center when it first opened, and seeing the historical photos and presentations, and learning about, I knew about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I was not aware of how many Chinese immigrants were actually coming through the border disguised as Mexican Americans or disguised as Mexicans. It kind of blew my mind, and was just another reminder of how our stories are interwoven in being othered in a country where Asian Americans have been present since the United States began, and Mexican Americans are actually in large part indigenous to this continent and have been here since the beginning. And yet the othering that affects us in just an instant, we see how on the news something all of a sudden can make our communities so vulnerable. So I didn't bring any slides, but I wanted to just share another little nugget of that history. I'm not representing the Planning Commission in any way, but I do serve on Austin's Planning Commission. And last year we had a historic designation case brought that had us talking about the Comal store in East Austin as a historic community grocery store. And Ayshea's nodding her head. Thank you so much for bringing your local history. I just wanted to share this photo for those of you who are not familiar. This is like a very historic building for East Austin in terms of being one of the longest standing food stores. And what's interesting about this is that the store was opened by Dutch immigrants prior to Austin's racial segregation, but then for some time was actually run. You can see a little bit of the historical background here. But one of the interesting pieces of this, the history of this building, is that it was actually purchased by Albert Eng in 1936. And it was he was of Chinese descent, Chinese American, and he operated this grocery store business until 1946. And I bring this up because this was, on the surface, when it came to the Planning Commission, it was sort of a case about, you know, a site in East Austin, in a historically Mexican American part of East Austin since segregation. And there was a conversation about, you know, how few historic landmarks we had on the east side. But one of the things that really stood out was once the discussion of it being Chinese American owned and managed for a while, I saw my fellow commissioner, James Shea, take extra interest in the issue, because he noted that there are so few historical landmarks or conversations about Asian run businesses in Austin's history. And it was just a reminder that while East Austin was explicitly racially segregated and a Negro district was created, this sort of de facto Mexican district just south of it was very much segregated, but it also became a culturally diverse area of non-white people and non-white businesses. And again, it's a reminder of our otherness. And I think it was interesting when we were racially categorizing ourselves, we were confronted with that tricky thing, which is that, we're not actually, I should say race is a specious concept, right? It's not a real thing, but it's a very powerful set of fictions, a very powerful set of projects, as Eric was referring to them. And so they absolutely shape the systems and the structures that we've inherited in this country. But the reality is that the truth is really in our cultural and ethnicity, our ethnic backgrounds and the culture that we share and exchange. And that can be one of the things that makes us most powerful. So acknowledging the history is critical. I started community organizing in the environmental justice movement, and I was actually being part of the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice with Poder here in Austin, that I started to learn about an incredible set of shared issues in the environmental justice movement, environmental racism that Asian Americans and Latinos and African Americans were all sharing in common. In particular, what we were seeing in the Mission District in San Francisco, but also just the gentrification issues, the housing conditions, so many issues across our communities that we had in common. And so I think the next thing I just want to touch on is the first thing that we can do is increase our awareness. And we do that by increasing our relationships and being very intentional in the way that we participate. So and thank you, Mayor Adler, for being here. I'm seeing that he's going to step off now, so appreciate his participation to this point. But I guess what I want to say there is that I don't usually do events on a Sunday. I'll just say that. But this was really important, and I was honored to be asked to talk about this. I think it's critical that our communities come together whenever we can. I served on the Latino Quality of Life Commission for several years, and was really so pleased with the work that the Quality of Life Commissions did together. And I have to give kudos to the Equity Office for bringing us together specifically around the budget, because it was a critical opportunity for us, not only to get to know each other better, but to understand how many issues we really could elevate if we stood with each other on them, whether it was immigration, language access, healthcare access, all of those things, and understanding the nuances, that the ways that our communities are affected differently, but how we all need to stand together, because when it really gets down to it, we are the majority when we actually collectively look at, racialized, marginalized people. And then the last thing is just the action. What does action actually look like when we're talking about solidarity? In many cases, it just looks like speaking out. I mean, many of you talked about the power of bystanders. And I think that, there have been a million famous quotes about this, whether it's Dr. King or Albert Einstein or John Stuart Mill. Evil and harm and pain, oppression only survives when good people do nothing. It's the majority around who have to first acknowledge and believe people. I think one of the struggles in Austin is that because we have such a liberal facade in Austin, it's very difficult for people who don't experience racism directly to believe that it is happening or to believe that it exists. I am equally heartbroken and devastated when I hear these stories that you all are talking about, but I don't doubt for a second that they're true. And I don't doubt that the fear also exists here in Austin, because I saw racism firsthand growing up here, and I'm not that old. I saw it very explicitly in the last several decades. And so I think it's critical that we use any voice that we have and any elevated presence to acknowledge the stories of what our fellow community members are going through. Several of you brought up the RISE funding. GAVA was very involved in organizing with several of the other organizations to push that funding. And we are also raising private funds right now. We've got almost $30,000 that I don't think GAVA's ever raised money so quickly in our history to do 100% direct cash assistance and relief. And so it's really, it's an amazing opportunity. And I just want to say that the distribution of those funds being effective depends entirely on the relationships of the community groups. So we all need to ensure that there is good representation for the Asian American communities. It's such a diverse umbrella, obviously, as part of, I think, a product of racism in the United States, is that so many people are lumped together under one umbrella. But we have to make sure that all of our communities are well represented in those organizations, in those nonprofits, because it's the relationships with people who are most directly impacted that are going to make sure that those funds actually reach the people who need them the most. And I just also wanted to mention, I think Hannah Huang, and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but Hannah had shared a link to Act to Change in one of the chats that had some great materials and resources about what does it look like to stand up? What does it look like to act? I think that those kinds of resources are great for people who are not quite sure where to start. But I think the most important place to start is just to listen, be curious, show up when you're invited, and listen to the stories and acknowledge, hear people out and fully believe it and share it, be loud about it. I'm grateful for, thank you, Hannah, for posting again that link, the Act to Change link. I'm grateful for the organization Meals on Wheels and more, that they serve so many people in our community. And they also receive generous city funding and funding under the umbrella of health equity. And it's important for us to hold all of our institutions lovingly accountable for how they're serving folks, and to make sure that people know that meals have been cut off now for almost a month. That's incredibly concerning to me. And you know, there are many of us who care deeply about racial justice from different backgrounds, who were concerned years ago when we heard that Asian American seniors were not getting the appropriate proteins and meals that they really needed. That's critical for all of us to care about, because it could be anyone in our community. So there are lots of other examples that I'm sure many of you here could provide. And I hope that this is a helpful small contribution. I can't represent the whole Latino community, but I can definitely say that we share so many of the same concerns, and whatever ways that GAVA and those that we're networked with can show up for your communities. We appreciate when you show up for ours. And I think that there's a lot more that we can do to correct a lot of these things. So thank you all so much. Thank you.
So just so you know, we are running over time. We have Deborah Alamu and Paula Rojas. They'll each be speaking for about 5 minutes, and then we had planned 15 minutes for audience participation. So we apologize if you aren't able to join us, but just please be aware that this is our schedule right now. So before we move on, I wanted to go ahead and ensure that the folks that are listening on the phone know the panelists were provided some questions beforehand. So the first question is, when working across communities of color, what does solidarity and justice look like for you? What are the challenges in this kind of work, and where have there been moments of success? And the second part is, when acts of harassment and racism occur, reporting to the police can seem to be the only option for a lot of folks, despite the police's history of abuse and mistrust. What are some alternative methods of reporting and community care that we can look towards? So now we have Deborah.
Hey, can y'all hear me okay? Dope. All right. Hey folks, thanks for having me. I grew up in Austin, South and East Austin. I'm a community organizer, co-founder of Andaki Black Network, and I work with the Black LGBTQ Migrant Project. In general, I support deportation defense of Black migrants, Black queer migrants as well. And I'm just going to jump right into a quote from none other than the revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr., who said that the prescription for the cure rests with the accurate diagnosis of the disease. I'll go ahead and repeat that. The prescription for the cure rests with the accurate diagnosis of the disease. If we can agree that racial capitalism is the real disease, then we need to cure this disease with a prescription for solidarity among the poor and dispossessed people of the world. This includes people who are incarcerated, people who are homeless, migrants, queer and transgender people, and everyone who is left behind by our common enemy, the profit-hungry capitalists and neglectful governments and government entities. Hundreds of years of history, as we saw earlier today in this presentation, hundreds of years of history have shown us that when US interest is threatened, the autonomy and sovereignty of other countries are immediately at risk. And the racist flames are fanned by mainstream media. The war on drugs in the 70s, 80s, and 90s fueled racist sentiment towards Black and brown people, war on drugs. The war on terror heightened Islamophobia in the early 2000s, all of which continues to this day. The US government applies pressures like sanctions and coups and puppet regimes whenever it is threatened by the strength of another country, like China in this case. Our government has been so quick to manufacture hate against an entire people, and this blinds Americans from seeing our common enemy. This is not a time for us to peddle the government or media lies of the model minority, nor is it a time to prove whose oppression hurts more. This is an opportunity to unify against the capitalist state. The same capitalism that is about to reopen the state prematurely so that the market doesn't continue to suffer, as if our lives are not more important. The same capitalism that keeps our wages stagnant and profits from mass incarceration of our bodies, the same capitalism that tells us to stay at home but refuses to shelter those in need, the same capitalism that calls its labor force essential but refuses to provide sufficient personal protective equipment. Now is a time for us to engage in dialogue that aims to educate our neighbors, mend harms between communities, build solidarity through mutual aid, grocery drives, organized rent and worker strikes, pledging stimulus funds to those in need, putting up hand washing stations, being explicitly anti-racist and anti-police repression, getting people into shelter and out of incarceration. That's solidarity. Solidarity is the Cuban government sending hundreds of doctors to countries in need, and China sending pop-up hospitals and supplies to Iran, while the US upholds sanctions against hungry people. This is vastly different from charity, because charity silences working class people with handouts when we begin to question our conditions. Solidarity, however, encourages people to speak up about their common enemy and doesn't gaslight or devalue its neighbors. By practicing solidarity, we are organizing our communities for long-term change of this disease system. Solidarity leaves no space for bystanders and holds people accountable for their prejudice without making an individual's ignorance the diagnosis of the disease. The disease is the system, y'all. I'm going to share another popular and powerful quote by Malcolm X, who said, "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing." That's the quote right behind me. The US government has decided to spew racist propaganda against Chinese people instead of talking about how it will ensure free testing for all or jobs for the 7 million Americans who have signed up for unemployment. Don't let the lies of the model minority fool you, as the merit-based rewards are conditional. They are conditional. Even for the most educated of Asian people in the community, the moment those who are generally respected are not serving the interest of the ruling elite, they will no longer be a model minority. Everything from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Japanese internment has shown us that when the US creates hostile policies, the racist sentiment follows. And when we buy into that hate, we are justifying the mobilization of our tax dollars and our bodies, our people, for war. Lessons from Black folks across the diaspora who can tell you unequivocally that racism did not start with COVID-19. We all know that. And it won't stop once we flatten the curve. Don't break up your culture. Don't break up your cultures or question your respectability to get approval from this racist system. Don't lose your accents. Don't forget your history just to join the capitalist minority that doesn't believe in your inherent dignity. You are worthy of freedom from mass incarceration, freedom to migrate, jobs with livable wages, housing, culturally, politically, historically accurate public education, access to quality healthcare regardless of your employment status. And I'm worthy of that too. It's through this mutual recognition of each other's inherent dignity that our common enemy and our common enemy that we can overcome systemic racism and its backbone, capitalism. So Amandla, Awetu, that means all power to the people. It's commonly said in South Africa, so.
That was great. Thank you so much, Deborah. So next we have Paola.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hey everyone, I know we're out of time and I've been following each of you. Thank you so much for all of those who've shared today. It's been really, really powerful. I hope this is recorded to be able to be shared out again. In particular, those who shared their personal stories, I just want to say thank you for your bravery in this space where we don't even know who the hundreds of people who are watching, who they are, and you're having that courage in that space, which in a way is almost harder than doing it in a physically, large space where you can see who is watching you. You can't see who's watching you. See, I can't see. And it's particularly powerful in this moment of social distancing. So thank you. I don't feel like I have so much to add. I want to just build off of maybe what Carmen and Deborah just said. I think I'm a mother and a midwife and a community organizer, and I'm seeing and taking care of families right now here in Austin who are being affected by this pandemic. And I can say that what I am experiencing day to day, more than families facing the virus, I'm experiencing families who are facing this larger disease, as Deborah called it out, the deeper structural problem of a racialized capitalist inequitable system, and that people are really on the edge of losing all resources to survive here in Austin, in this progressive city, right? The bubble that we have where we think that people are doing okay. It turns out there's a whole lot of people that are not doing okay right now, who are running out of food, who are running out of soap, who do not have cars to come park up and get food put into their car. They don't have a car to do that. And who do not, if there were testing, who could not do drive-up testing. People who are on their bicycles right now, going around the city trying to find resources to feed their families. This is what I see happening. And in that context, people are pregnant and having babies, trying to feed their families. And that's what I'm seeing. And we're in a city that is, as others pointed out, a majority people of color city, though it doesn't feel that way. So the veneer is that we're in this great place where we're all doing well, where people are friendly and treating each other well, when there's really an underbelly of Austin that I think is where the solidarity work needs to focus. So some thoughts that I have is that in addition to really connecting these pieces of how different communities of color are being impacted by this moment with Asian Americans, in the front of the direct kind of hate that's being put out to people, and people are having to feel it in their physical bodies, right? Then there's the way that other communities are facing different forms of direct violence as well, in terms of, I know in health, we came to this pandemic with, in terms of access to healthcare, quality of healthcare, and outcomes of healthcare, being very unequal for different people in this city and in this country. So Black and Brown communities already were poised to be harmed more than others in relation to health outcomes of this virus or any virus. And that is what we're going to be seeing more of, and we have to get ready for. And in terms of the economic situation as well, who are the communities that are most vulnerable, who after 1 month of not having a paycheck are going to not be able to survive in this city, is also communities who came into this pandemic more vulnerable. And so one of the pieces that I feel like was pulled out a little bit by Darlene that I wanted to pull back on is the intersectionality of thinking about who are people that are kind of facing that brunt on multiple levels. So both as Asian people who are read as Asian physically, but who are also unemployed or underemployed right now, who are also don't have access to health care of quality or access at all, who are women who are holding up this whole, holding us all up in every household, trying to keep people alive and surviving. So when we think about poor and working class Asian women right now, what is happening to those families and those who are really facing so much of this? I think we want to think about how we would support those folks in particular who are facing it from all directions, and then thinking about how we might not just individually, but collectively think of some creative actions. And I know we don't have time to do that now, but my mind was racing throughout, thinking about what are ways that we can take some physical action, even in this moment in our communities, to put out the real diagnosis so that we can raise consciousness, but also showing acts of solidarity physically. Is it going together to supermarkets, you know, when people have to go, because some people don't have to go to supermarkets, they can order deliveries, right? While others, you can't do that, can't afford to do that. Thinking about taking actions like that. And I wanted to also share that I'm part of a coalition, Communities of Color United for Racial Justice here in Austin, where we have launched a racial and economic solidarity mutual aid network that is moving money from people who have resources to people who don't by doing cash deliveries and Venmos. And we've raised $25,000 in less than 3 weeks and have dispersed almost all of it to those families who are most on the edge. And we are doing that through phone calls with families because we know who the families are, and finding out who's 1 week away from running out of food or soap or whatever they need, supporting people to not pay rent right now, and helping people have access to healthcare. So those are ways that we all, in addition to individual acts of solidarity, I think we need to start to think about collective acts of solidarity in organizations that cross our different communities to support each other in organized and collective ways. Because as someone pointed out, oh, there's nice people too at the supermarket. Sure, that's true. But if we're just seeing it in individual ways, we can't actually make systemic change. So I think in Austin, this is a moment where we need to think on some collective acts of solidarity for Asians right now that are interlinked with the acts of solidarity for those who are facing health inequities, economic inequities, and think really creatively of how to do that together. I don't have the solution, but I do have ideas of some tools, and I'm very interested in working with others. We're starting a sewing cooperative of people making masks right now. We've got lots of donated sewing machines. That's what I've been doing this morning while watching you, trying to get those sewing machines picked up and taken around. There's many ways that we could think about who are most vulnerable right now and how could we take collective action to support those folks in the moment. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Paola. So for the audience participation for the next 15 minutes, we just want to ask what steps that you would like to see to create solidarity, what solidarity means to you. And for those allies, you are welcome to also ask maybe what steps folks recommend for y'all. So please just raise your hand if you, click on the raise hand button. Oh, so we have Rashmi.
You guys can see me?
Not yet. Can you start your video?
Oh, yeah. Now you can see me, right?
Yes.
Oh, hi. Just a very quick thing that's going on in my mind. I mean, first of all, it's so relevant and very important discussion here. And I appreciate Haley and others to take this initiative. This is what we are supposed to be talking right now. So when I was listening to Dr. Eric Tang's presentation, and one, I'm a sociologist, so this is such a relevant and important discussion in terms of the historical context of racism, and especially when you were mentioning about the Andrew Young's comment, and it just reminded me some of the speeches that Barack Obama, our ex-president Barack Obama, when he used to address the young Black population. The tone was kind of similar. Right now, I do not have the exact quote, but I do remember that he used to suggest to the Black youth to prove themselves as better citizens, to do more for the society. So, I mean, I think that's sort of an approach. And I do agree with you that, I mean, the problematic tone in that message, that you don't need to validate yourself, where we all should be doing more of our civic responsibilities and trying to be good citizens. That's one. But holistically, I mean, we have nothing to prove to be better citizen or equal citizens like the white Americans. So that is just a thought that I had in my mind. And also I have observed that survey, that quick survey that Haley did in terms of solidarity among the Asian Americans with the other person of color. As you have seen, like not a high percentage of solidarity, especially the city where we live. And I relocated in Austin, it's about 2 years now. And I lived in the Vancouver, Canada for about 7 years. And after that, I lived in New York for 2 years, I mean, before moving to Austin. So my observation comparing to the other two big cosmopolitan cities I lived, I think that there is a lot to do in terms of creating the interracial conversation in this city. That doesn't happen too organically. It could happen in certain neighborhood or certain areas or certain workspace, but as a cosmopolitan city, and particularly which is growing pretty fast, because so many Asian population in recent years are moving to this city. And also, again, Dr. Tang mentioned about the class context among the Asians, which is very critical, and the Asian, smart Asian myth among the Asians. So that is kind of, I think, is a big impediment, a challenge, not acknowledging the Asians as one same platform. I mean, it is not only that being people of color, even among the Asians, that I mean, South Asians and other Asian populations, there need to be a lot more interconnection, a lot more dialogue, a lot more exchange among all these Asian communities to grow as a more cosmopolitan citizen. Those are just my thoughts. Where I was listening to all of your very important and relevant discussions here.
Thank you, Reshmi. And just real quickly to kind of bring your point together with the points that Paula, Carmen, and others have brought up around solidarity. Mm-hmm. Look, Andrew Yang's comments are born out of a certain fear, right? A fear that if you don't demonstrate positive images of Asians, that you're going to catch more hell. But the truth is just the opposite will happen. You kind of promoting this positive images of like patriotic Asians, actually history has told us enables more racism. I won't get into how, but that it's theoretically flawed to think that you're going to find political coverage if you concede to the racists, because there is a reactionary movement in this country that is just irremovable. It's there. It's not going to go away. And what's happening right now is you have a president which is allowing more room for that reactionary, some might say fascist movement to roam, to kind of have more room to do what it does. And so Asian Americans are fearful now because they feel it and they're looking for political coverage. And I think what we're trying to say on this call is that that political coverage won't come from positive images. It'll come from working with other communities of color to establish enough coverage and protection. Does that make sense? And so kind of bringing some of these suggestions together, I think that if in the next few months, as we see anti-Asian hate crimes grow, and they will, folks, there's just no question, it's gonna get bad. And as we see infection rates and Black mortality rates, grow in Black communities, and as we see the disproportionate impact of the economic fallout on Latinx communities, are we going to articulate these issues together, or are we going to kind of figure out how to address them in silos? And I think for Asian Americans, we're going to get more political protection for what's coming, because it's coming, if we articulate together. And so, these attempts at triaging, the racism, I don't know if that's really going to work. It's really about, again, finding a way to kind of say, all right, we get what's happening, we get what's coming, and we're all going to present this as one broad anti-racist front. I know that sounds very vague, but as a beginning, as like a first step, it seems to me like that's the important thing to do. And I absolutely agree with Paula and others when they say that, look, we need to maybe begin with people who sit at the intersections of all these different things, figure out what they could use, and then build out from there.
Thank you, Eric. We have one more question and then we'll have to close it up after that.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm Hannah, and I just wanted to bring up that as we're talking about solidarity and working with all the social service agencies to serve Asian Americans across all economic spectrums, that some of the things we should keep in mind and talk about is why Asian Americans might not be using resources as much as other communities. So kind of going into issues of not just access, but of culture, and how with Asian communities, it's very difficult for them to kind of put that face or pride aside and take help, even in this time and of unprecedented need. So I think having these conversations are really great ways for us in this coalition to kind of educate our social service providers and nonprofits in that as well. Asians love a good bargain, but if you ask them to get a handout, it's kind of like cutting their hand off, right? So I see a lot of examples in the community where I have a lot of Asian community members who tell me about how much they love places like Austin Creative Reuse. So they'll go and buy affordable art supplies, but they won't go to a food pantry. So it's really interesting to keep these kind of cultural aspects in mind as we're building solidarity and to educate our friends and allies on these topics. And that's really all I had to add to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. So thank you all for participating and being brave and coming onto the camera. So we're gonna just close this off by, Lucy would like to share just maybe some resources that Austin Asian Community Health Initiative can provide. And, you know, if we're really great at providing referrals. So, you know, if you need us to help you find something, we'll be available for that.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank all of our panelists and our amazing attendees for being here after the 12 o'clock hit. I hope that everyone and your families are healthy and safe. Again, my name is Lucy. I'm the program manager for the Community Health Navigator program at AAPI. Again, we'll make sure that we share all the resources that were discussed today. And if you have any other resources, feel free to add that to the chat feature or just email us after and we'll make sure that gets distributed. As you guys heard today, many folks in the Asian and other communities are affected by this pandemic, not just health and safety wise, but very much so economically. AAPI is really working to compile and create specific language accessible COVID-19 resources for the communities that we serve. And you can see that available on our website at aachi.org. And I'll make sure to link that in the chat below as well. AAPI provides free health resource and navigation to Asian and immigrant communities. And specifically, we have navigators that work with Arabic speakers, Burmese, Korean, Nepali, and Vietnamese communities. If you know anyone or you are someone who needs help navigating the healthcare or are suffering economically due to COVID-19, please feel free to contact our community navigators that work in those communities, and we can help them either navigate the health space or even things such as helping them fill out their unemployment applications or understanding their how the stimulus checks work. I do want to share one last thing about, as we talk about intersectionality and solidarity, is a quote from Leela Watson. I heard this yesterday at the Act to Change webinar and it really resonated with me. It's, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for convening us. I agree. I don't remember who said having this historical perspective from Eric Tang and Ayshea Khan, the local, has been very powerful. I'm so grateful to have gotten to know, you know, Carmen and Deborah and Paula and Akeela, you know, Lucy, what y'all are doing, and Haley. I think we should meet again and ask for more. I mean, I think that as we're probably all organizationally, you know, planning for what does sustainability look like, what does post-COVID look like, and we don't want to go back to the same way, right? I mean, I think that to stabilize, there is some important voice and experience that we have to put forward as we think about how to rebuild the city and rebuild our economies that are inclusive and just for us all. And so, I mean, I think I'd love to convene again and think about, you know, how do we plan together and coordinate together? And maybe you're already doing that and I'm just late to the party, but I'd love to join whatever is going on. So thank you, Haley, for bringing us together, and thank you all for your incredible work. It's just been a powerful, powerful Sunday.
Yeah, thanks to everybody.
One concrete next step, we can get some of these stories, even if they're anecdotal at first and not hard data, shared together, because Vong, you know, your presentation around what's happening with the Burmese refugee community, we need to know that. That's just not something that's accessible. I mean, people aren't accessing it, you know, they should be. And maybe at the very least, we can start kind of looking at what are the different things that we're not seeing coming out of, you know, Asian refugee communities or other places that we need to start paying attention to. And Darlene, the anecdotes you shared as well, these are the things that are flying beneath the radar. And I thought maybe a next step could be about just how we coalesce some of that and do it quickly.
And I would just add another thing, because we don't need to create more and more spaces because we're all involved in organizing in so many spaces. I want us to lift up the equity office right now. When we think about citywide, what we can do, right? That could we really do it through the equity office, because they're on that line. If it wasn't for the equity office right now, can you imagine how things would be framed in the city? They are making sure that there's a lens that's looking at kind of racial justice issues at every level of what's happening in the city. And so I think we really need to be supporting the equity office more, pushing for the equity office to have more resources, and moving. I love your idea, Darlene, but could we move it into the equity action team? That's the monthly thing that the equity office puts on, that's community groups and city people together thinking about racial equity for the city. Could we move this conversation there so that we can bring in other folks? I'm like feeling random. Why am I here and not, all these other people that I work with who I'd want to have here bring their wisdom. So that's just one way. I think there's a equity action team meeting coming up soon.
Does equity office track the hate crime stuff, or is that human rights? Like, who does that fall under?
Kelly knows that. I wouldn't know. Kelly, are you there? We
All
can
right. So
answer it later, but
we understand. Thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and close the call. I'm so grateful for everyone who came. Your presence, I don't know if you know this, means a lot to so many people. Many of our clients have come. Many of these people feel invisible, unsupported, and unheard. So your presence here has shown them that they are not alone. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you, Haley.